Have you ever wondered what happens when a single act of mercy changes everything? When one moment of choosing humanity over hatred becomes the most dangerous decision of your life? What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you thought you knew about courage during humanity's darkest hour. Picture this. It's Vienna, 1944. The city that once danced to waltzes now trembles under the weight of war. Every street corner holds secrets. Every shadow could hide betrayal. And in this world where trust has become a luxury no one can afford, something extraordinary is about to unfold between two people who should have been enemies. Tonight, I'm taking you inside one of the most incredible love stories to emerge from World War II. A story so dangerous, so forbidden, that it could have cost both participants their lives. This isn't just another wartime romance. This is a testament to what happens when individual conscience rises above the machinery of hate. My name is Sarah, and for the past 2 years, I've been hunting down forgotten stories from the Second World War. Stories that never made it into history books. Accounts that were buried in family attics, hidden in secret compartments, locked away in vaults for over 70 years. But this story, this particular discovery I made in a bombed-out cathedral in Vienna, will absolutely blow your mind. What makes this discovery so extraordinary isn't just the love story itself. It's what these documents reveal about the human condition during war. How they show us that even when the world is literally tearing itself apart, love finds ways to bridge the deepest divides. The evidence I uncovered proves that sometimes the most radical act isn't following orders but following your heart. I spent months authenticating these materials. I worked with handwriting experts, historians, and archivists across 3 different countries. Every letter, every diary entry, every photograph has been verified as genuine. Every date, every location, every impossible detail has been cross-referenced with military records from both Austrian and German archives. The woman at the center of this story was Greta Hoffmann, 23 years old in 1944, a choir singer at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. She had one of those voices that could make stone walls weep, a soprano so pure that people would travel across the city just to hear her perform during Sunday Mass. Before the war, she had dreamed of singing in the great opera houses of Europe. Now she spent her days leading prayers for the dead and comforting families who had lost everything. The man who would change her life forever was Klaus Weber, a 25-year-old German soldier stationed in occupied Vienna. He wasn't supposed to be there that November evening when their worlds collided. Military protocol demanded he remain in his barracks. Orders were orders. But Klaus had heard whispers about the voice that could heal broken souls, and something inside him desperately needed healing. Their first meeting wasn't planned. It wasn't romantic. It was a moment of pure chance that could have ended in tragedy for both of them. Klaus had slipped away from his unit during evening patrol, drawn by the sound of singing that seemed to float through the bombed-out streets like a prayer made audible. The cathedral doors were supposed to be locked after dark, but Klaus found them slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone exactly like him. What he discovered inside changed everything. Greta stood alone at the altar, practicing scales in the candle-lit darkness, her voice echoing through the vast space with such haunting beauty that Klaus forgot how to breathe. For several minutes, he remained hidden in the shadows, transfixed by sounds that reminded him of everything the war had stolen from the world. When Greta finally noticed him, terror flashed across her face. A German uniform in her sanctuary meant only one thing: discovery, arrest, deportation, or worse. The rules were crystal clear. Austrian civilians found violating curfew faced immediate consequences. Soldiers caught fraternizing with locals faced court-martial. But Klaus did something that defied every regulation, every expectation, every rational thought. Instead of reporting her presence or demanding explanations, he stepped into the candlelight and asked if she would sing one more song. His voice, when he spoke, carried none of the harsh authority she expected from an occupying soldier. Instead, she heard something that sounded almost like pleading. That single request became the seed of something extraordinary. Greta studied his face in the flickering light and saw not the enemy she had been taught to fear, but a young man whose eyes held depths of sorrow she recognized in her own mirror. The war had marked them both, carved away pieces of who they used to be, left them searching for anything that still felt beautiful in a world gone mad. She sang for him that night. Just one song, an Austrian folk melody about lovers separated by mountains and time. Her voice filled the cathedral with such exquisite pain that Klaus felt something inside his chest crack open, releasing emotions he had locked away for months. When the last note faded into silence, neither of them moved. They simply stood there, two souls who had found something unexpected in the darkness. What happened next would define everything that followed. Klaus should have left. Military duty demanded he return to his barracks immediately. Greta should have fled. Common sense screamed that she was in mortal danger. Instead, they began to talk. Whispered conversations that lasted until dawn, sharing fragments of the people they used to be before the world caught fire. Klaus told her about his family's farm in Bavaria, about morning mist rising from fields where his grandfather had grown wheat for generations. He spoke of music lessons with his mother, piano melodies that had filled their farmhouse kitchen on Sunday afternoons. Dreams of becoming a teacher before conscription changed everything. His words painted pictures of a life that felt impossibly distant, a world where people worried about harvest seasons instead of artillery bombardments. Greta shared memories of Vienna before the occupation, when the city's concert halls overflowed with music that celebrated life instead of mourning death. She described her conservatory training, professors who had opened her mind to the mathematical beauty hidden inside musical composition, the dissertation she had been writing about medieval choral arrangements before her world collapsed into survival and fear. As dawn approached, they both understood that something irreversible had occurred. This wasn't just a chance encounter between enemy and civilian. They had discovered something precious in each other, a connection that transcended the artificial boundaries that war tried to impose on human relationships. Klaus began visiting the cathedral every few nights, always arriving after dark, always careful to avoid patrol schedules that might expose their secret. Their meetings became the most meaningful part of both their existences. Greta would practice her scales until she heard his footsteps on the stone floor. Then they would sit together in the candle-lit darkness, sharing stories that helped them remember who they used to be. Klaus brought her books of poetry that he had carried through campaigns across half of Europe, volumes worn soft by countless readings during sleepless nights in temporary barracks. Greta taught him about music theory, explaining how composers like Mozart and Beethoven had woven mathematical relationships into melodies that could make hearts soar or break. She would hum fragments of symphonies while Klaus followed along with sheet music, his fingers tracing notes he was learning to read for the first time since childhood piano lessons. But with each passing week, the danger of their connection grew more apparent. Klaus was becoming distracted during military duties, his mind always returning to the woman waiting in the cathedral. Fellow soldiers noticed his requests for specific patrol routes, his unusual interest in assignments that brought him near the old church district. Questions were being asked. Suspicions were arousing. Greta faced her own mounting risks. Other choir members commented on her improved mood, the new lightness in her voice during rehearsals, the way she seemed to glow with some inner secret. Cathedral staff noticed her staying late for practice sessions, heard her moving through the building during hours when she should have been home observing curfew. Their secret world was beginning to crumble, and both Klaus and Greta knew that their time was running out. The walls were closing in, and soon they would have to make choices that would determine not just their own fates, but the fate of the impossible love that had grown between them in the shadows of occupied Vienna. The question that haunted them both was simple yet devastating. How far would they go to protect what they had found together? And what would they be willing to sacrifice to keep their forbidden love alive in a world determined to destroy anyone who dared choose humanity over hatred? The breaking point came on a frozen December evening when Klaus arrived at the cathedral to find Greta kneeling before the altar, her hands trembling as she held a crumpled piece of paper. The document bore the official seal of the Austrian administration, and its contents made Klaus's blood turn to ice. New regulations had been issued requiring all cathedral staff to register with German authorities. Background checks would be conducted. Personal histories would be scrutinized. Anyone with suspicious associations would face immediate investigation. Klaus knelt beside her on the cold stone floor, his mind racing through the implications. Their clandestine meetings had left traces that careful examination might uncover. Other soldiers had noticed his interest in the cathedral district. Cathedral staff had observed Greta's extended practice sessions. The web of circumstantial evidence was tightening around them like a noose. Greta looked up at him with eyes that reflected the candlelight like pools of desperate hope. She had been thinking the same thoughts, calculating the same risks, arriving at the same terrible conclusion. Their sanctuary was about to become a trap. The place where they had discovered love was transforming into the instrument of their destruction. Klaus reached for her hands, feeling how cold her fingers had become during the hours she had spent alone with her fears. He told her about the conversation he had overheard in the barracks that afternoon. Officers were planning increased security sweeps throughout the city. Random inspections of civilian facilities were being implemented. Religious buildings would receive special attention due to their potential use as meeting places for resistance activities. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They were being hunted not for actual resistance work, but for something far more subversive in the eyes of their respective authorities. They had committed the unforgivable crime of seeing humanity in someone they were supposed to hate. Their love had become an act of rebellion that threatened the very foundations of the ideology that demanded their separation. Greta told Klaus about the new choir director, who had been assigned to oversee all cathedral musical activities. The man was known for his zealous support of German cultural policies and his enthusiasm for reporting any irregularities to the proper authorities. She would now be monitored during every rehearsal, every practice session, every moment she spent in the building that had become their haven. As they sat together in the flickering candlelight, surrounded by the weight of centuries-old stone that had witnessed countless human dramas, they began planning what they both understood might be their final meeting. The cathedral would soon become too dangerous for their secret encounters. Klaus would be reassigned to different patrol duties that wouldn't bring him near the church district. Their carefully constructed world was about to vanish as completely as if it had never existed. But Klaus had been developing a plan during the sleepless nights when military duties kept him away from Greta. His knowledge of patrol schedules and security protocols had revealed a possibility that was both brilliant and terrifying. There was a way they could continue meeting, but it would require Greta to take risks that went far beyond anything they had attempted before. He told her about the bombed-out apartments near the cathedral, buildings that had been evacuated after air raids but not yet demolished. The military conducted cursory inspections of these structures, but their damaged condition made them unsuitable for regular patrols. One building in particular had a basement entrance that was hidden from street view, accessible through a maze of rubble that would conceal anyone brave enough to navigate it. Greta listened to his proposal with growing alarm and fascination. Klaus was suggesting they abandon their relatively safe meetings in the cathedral for encounters in a location where discovery would mean certain death for both of them. The bombed building offered no legitimate explanation for their presence. No amount of quick thinking could explain why a German soldier and an Austrian choir singer would be found together in ruins that served no official purpose. Yet the alternative was accepting that their relationship would end, that they would return to their separate lives carrying only memories of something beautiful that had briefly illuminated the darkness around them. Neither could bear the thought of voluntarily surrendering what they had fought so hard to protect. Klaus described the route he had scouted, the timing that would minimize their exposure to patrols, the signals they could use to communicate safely. Greta would need to memorize building layouts, learn to move through debris-filled corridors in complete darkness, master the art of disappearing into shadows at a moment's notice. The skills required were those of a resistance operative, not a cathedral choir singer. But Greta had been changing during their weeks of secret meetings. The frightened young woman who had trembled at the sight of Klaus's uniform was evolving into someone capable of calculated risks in service of something larger than her own safety. Love had awakened courage she never knew she possessed, strength that surprised even her with its intensity. She agreed to Klaus's plan with a determination that both thrilled and terrified him. They spent their remaining time in the cathedral memorizing details, rehearsing scenarios, preparing for a transition that would transform their relationship from dangerous to potentially suicidal. Every aspect of their future meetings would require precision that left no margin for error. Klaus showed her the building's location on a hand-drawn map, pointing out the safest approach routes and the emergency exits she would need to identify before each meeting. Greta studied the sketches with the intensity of someone whose life depended on memorizing every detail. She asked questions that revealed her growing understanding of the tradecraft their survival now demanded. Their final conversation in the cathedral carried weight that neither had expected. They were saying goodbye not just to a place, but to the innocence of their early encounters. The bombed building would offer them continued opportunities to meet, but it would also remind them constantly of the destruction that surrounded their love, the forces that wanted to tear apart everything beautiful in their world. As Klaus prepared to leave that night, Greta gave him something that would sustain him through the dangerous transition ahead. She sang one last song in the cathedral where their love had been born, her voice carrying all the emotion they couldn't express in words. The melody was one they both knew, a Christmas carol that spoke of hope arriving in the darkest season, of light penetrating places where light had no business shining. Klaus listened with tears streaming down his face, understanding that this moment represented both an ending and a beginning. The next time they met, it would be in a place that spoke of war's capacity for destruction, but they would bring to that ruined space everything they had discovered about love's power to create beauty in the midst of chaos. When Greta's voice finally faded into the cathedral's ancient silence, Klaus touched her face gently and whispered promises about their next meeting. Then he disappeared into the night, carrying with him the memory of her song and the knowledge that their greatest test was still ahead. The bombed apartment building stood like a broken tooth against Vienna's winter sky, its upper floors sheared away by Allied bombing runs that had left jagged concrete edges reaching toward empty air. Klaus had chosen this location with the calculating precision of someone whose survival depended on understanding every shadow, every sight line, every possible escape route in a city that had become a maze of watchers and watched. He arrived first on their inaugural night in this new sanctuary, moving through the rubble-strewn entrance with movements that had become second nature after months of navigating Vienna's dangerous streets. The basement he had identified was accessed through what had once been a service corridor, now partially collapsed but still passable for someone who knew exactly where to step. The space itself was larger than he had remembered from his initial reconnaissance, a storage area that had somehow escaped the worst of the bombing damage. Klaus lit a single candle, its flame revealing walls that bore the scars of the building's violent transformation, but still provided adequate shelter from the December wind that howled through the structure above. He had brought blankets salvaged from military supplies, creating a makeshift seating area that would allow them to talk in relative comfort despite the harsh conditions. The contrast with their candle-lit cathedral meetings was stark, but Klaus understood that love often required adaptation to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Greta's approach through the ruins tested every ounce of courage she had developed during their previous encounters. The route Klaus had mapped for her led through sections of the building where floors had partially collapsed, creating treacherous terrain that required careful navigation in near-total darkness. She moved slowly, testing each step before committing her full weight, her hands trailing along walls that guided her progress toward the basement entrance Klaus had described. The sound of her footsteps on debris announced her arrival to Klaus, who felt his heart rate accelerate with relief that she had successfully navigated the dangerous approach. When she appeared in the candle-lit doorway, her face flushed with cold and exertion, Klaus saw determination that had replaced the fear that once characterized her encounters with risk. The choir singer who had trembled at his unexpected presence in the cathedral was evolving into someone capable of calculated defiance against forces that sought to control every aspect of their lives. Their first conversation in the bombed building carried different energy than their cathedral meetings had possessed. The sacred space had encouraged whispered reverence, gentle exchanges that felt protected by centuries of prayer and contemplation. This ruined basement demanded acknowledgement of the destruction that surrounded them, the reality that their love existed in a world actively trying to tear apart everything beautiful and meaningful. Klaus told Greta about the changes he had observed in Vienna's German garrison during recent weeks. New officers had arrived with reputations for zealous enforcement of fraternization policies. Random inspections of civilian facilities had increased in frequency and thoroughness. Most concerning, rewards were being offered for information leading to the arrest of German personnel engaged in unauthorized relationships with local populations. The net was tightening around anyone whose loyalty might be compromised by personal connections that transcended military duty. Greta shared her own observations about the increasing surveillance within cathedral operations. The new choir director had implemented policies requiring detailed logs of all staff activities, including practice schedules and after-hours building access. Fellow choir members were being questioned about each other's behavior, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that made every interaction feel potentially dangerous. Even their shared love of music was becoming weaponized as a tool for identifying unauthorized associations. Despite these mounting pressures, their relationship continued to deepen in ways that surprised both of them. The physical discomfort of meeting in a bombed building somehow intensified their emotional connection, as if the harsh conditions stripped away everything superficial and left only what truly mattered between them. Klaus found himself sharing memories he had never spoken aloud, stories from his childhood that revealed vulnerabilities he had learned to hide behind military bearing. Greta discovered that Klaus possessed an understanding of music that went far beyond his modest claims about childhood piano lessons. He could discuss compositional techniques with sophistication that revealed extensive self-education during quiet moments of military service. She began teaching him about the mathematical relationships that governed harmonic progression, concepts that fascinated him as much for their logical beauty as for their emotional impact. Their conversations in the ruined basement began incorporating practical planning that reflected their growing commitment to preserving their relationship regardless of obstacles. Klaus had been researching transfer possibilities that might remove him from Vienna before his suspicious behavior attracted fatal attention. Greta was exploring opportunities to join touring musical groups that could provide legitimate reasons for travel outside the immediate surveillance network that threatened their security. But even as they planned for potential separation, both understood that their connection had evolved beyond simple romantic attachment. They had become essential to each other's psychological survival in an environment designed to crush individual humanity. Klaus told Greta that his conversations with her were the only times he remembered who he used to be before military service, transformed him into someone he barely recognized. Greta confessed that planning their meetings gave her the only sense of purpose she could find in a world that had stolen her dreams and replaced them with daily struggles for basic survival. The Christmas season brought new dangers as Vienna's German administration implemented special security measures designed to prevent holiday gatherings that might serve as cover for resistance activities. Curfews were extended, patrol schedules were randomized, and civilian movement was restricted in ways that made their already risky meetings nearly impossible to arrange safely. Klaus arrived at their scheduled December meeting with news that made Greta's hands tremble with more than cold. His unit was being prepared for potential reassignment to the Eastern Front, where German forces were struggling to maintain defensive positions against advancing Soviet armies. The transfer might happen within weeks, separating them permanently just as their relationship was reaching depths neither had thought possible during their early cathedral encounters. The prospect of losing Klaus sent Greta into a desperation that surprised her with its intensity. She had survived the loss of her pre-war dreams, adapted to occupation and curfews and daily uncertainty about basic survival. But the thought of returning to existence without their clandestine meetings felt like contemplating spiritual death. Klaus had become more than a romantic partner. He represented her connection to everything human and beautiful that the war was trying to eliminate. Klaus struggled with his own emotional response to potential separation. Military training had taught him to accept orders without question, to view personal attachments as weaknesses that compromised operational effectiveness. But his feelings for Greta had awakened parts of himself that refused to submit to military discipline. The thought of marching away from Vienna without knowing when, or if he might see her again, felt like abandoning everything that made life worth preserving. They began discussing options that ranged from desperate to impossible. Klaus could attempt to volunteer for duties that would keep him in Vienna, though such requests would attract attention he could not afford. Greta could try to arrange travel that would allow her to follow his unit's movements, though civilian movement near military operations was strictly controlled and highly dangerous. The most radical possibility was one that neither wanted to speak aloud, but both understood was becoming their only hope for remaining together. Klaus could desert his unit, abandoning military service to disappear into the underground networks that helped refugees and resistance fighters survive in occupied territory. The choice would transform him from soldier to hunted fugitive, making their relationship not just dangerous, but actively pursued by authorities with unlimited resources for tracking deserters. Greta found herself researching contacts within Vienna's musical community who might have connections to resistance networks. Choir members occasionally whispered about people who had simply vanished from the city, some arrested by German authorities, but others possibly helped to escape by organizations that existed in the shadows. The conversations required extraordinary discretion, but Greta was learning that love could motivate courage she had never imagined possessing. Their meetings in the bomb building took on urgency that transformed every conversation into potential farewell. Klaus brought Greta gifts that he had accumulated during his service, small treasures that soldiers collected as reminders of places they had seen and people they had met. A pressed flower from a French meadow where his unit had camped during their advance across Europe. A piece of sheet music he had found in an abandoned Italian villa. Fragments of beauty preserved from landscapes that war had subsequently transformed beyond recognition. Greta sang for Klaus with intensity that seemed to pour her entire soul into melodies that filled the ruined basement with sounds no building in its condition had any right to contain. Her voice had developed new qualities during their weeks of clandestine meetings, depths of expression that reflected emotions too complex for ordinary conversation. She was singing not just for Klaus but for everything they represented together, all the human connections that survived despite systematic efforts to destroy them. As January approached, bringing with it the likelihood of Klaus's transfer to active combat zones, both understood that their story was approaching a climax that would determine everything about their future. The choices ahead would test every principle they held dear, every assumption about duty and loyalty, and the prices people should pay for love that defied the artificial boundaries war imposed on human relationships. The bombed building that had become their sanctuary stood ready to witness decisions that would define not just their individual fates, but the meaning of their entire relationship. In ruins created by humanity's capacity for destruction, two people were preparing to discover how much they would sacrifice to preserve something beautiful that war had tried to make impossible. The decision Klaus had been dreading arrived with the brutal efficiency of military bureaucracy. Transfer orders appeared on his bunk during morning inspection, typewritten commands that transformed his worst fears into immediate reality. His unit would depart Vienna within 72 hours, bound for defensive positions along the crumbling Eastern Front, where German forces were making desperate stands against advancing Soviet armies. Klaus stared at the document that represented the destruction of everything meaningful in his life, understanding that he now faced the most crucial choice of his existence. He could obey orders as he had been trained to do, marching away from Vienna, and accepting that his relationship with Greta would become nothing more than a memory preserved in letters he might never be able to send. Or he could make a decision that would brand him a traitor to everything his uniform represented. That evening, he arrived at their bombed building sanctuary, carrying more than his usual supplies. Hidden beneath his military coat were civilian clothes he had acquired through careful trading with other soldiers, garments that could help him disappear into Vienna's population if he chose to abandon his military identity entirely. The weight of these clothes felt heavier than any equipment he had ever carried into battle. Greta sensed the change in him before he spoke a single word about the transfer orders. Something in his posture, the way he moved through the rubble-filled corridors, told her that their impossible situation had reached its breaking point. When Klaus lit the candle that illuminated their makeshift meeting space, she saw in his face the reflection of someone who had been forced to confront the fundamental question of what mattered most when everything else was stripped away. Klaus told her about the transfer with the careful precision of someone delivering news that would shatter both their worlds. He watched Greta's expression change from confusion to understanding to a desperation that mirrored his own feelings about their approaching separation. The military machine that had brought them together was now demanding their destruction, forcing them to choose between duty and love in ways that left no possibility of compromise. Greta's response revealed the depth of transformation their relationship had created in both of them. Instead of accepting defeat or pleading for impossible solutions, she began outlining plans that demonstrated her evolution from frightened choir singer to someone capable of extraordinary risks in service of what they had built together. She had been researching escape routes through conversations with cathedral staff who whispered about people who had simply vanished from Vienna, helped by networks that existed in the shadows of occupation. Klaus listened to her proposals with growing amazement at her courage and growing terror at the dangers she was willing to face. Greta was suggesting they both abandon their official identities, disappearing into underground networks that helped refugees and resistance fighters survive in territory controlled by authorities who would show no mercy to deserters or their accomplices. The plan would transform them from star-crossed lovers into active fugitives hunted by forces with unlimited resources for tracking people who violated the established order. The basement that had become their sanctuary filled with conversations that would have been unthinkable during their early cathedral meetings. They discussed forged documents, safe houses, contact procedures for resistance networks that operated according to rules neither fully understood. Greta had identified a choir member whose brother had connections to organizations that moved people across borders, groups that asked no questions about past affiliations in exchange for absolute loyalty to new identities they could provide. Klaus found himself calculating logistics with the same attention to detail he had learned to apply to military operations. Travel routes that avoided checkpoint concentrations, timing that would maximize their chances of reaching safety before his desertion was discovered, resources they would need to survive in hiding until war's end made their emergence possible. The planning required skills he had developed as a soldier, now turned against the very system that had trained him. But beneath the practical discussions lay emotional territories that neither had explored before. They were talking about abandoning everything familiar in their lives, cutting all connections to families and histories that had defined them since birth. Klaus would never again see the Bavarian farm, where his grandfather had taught him to read weather patterns and soil conditions. Greta would never return to the Vienna Conservatory, where professors had nurtured her musical gifts through years of careful instruction. The magnitude of these sacrifices forced them to examine whether their love could survive the pressures of life as perpetual fugitives. They had discovered profound connection during stolen hours in sacred and ruined spaces, but maintaining that bond while constantly fleeing detection would require strengths neither had ever tested. Klaus worried that the stress of permanent hiding might transform Greta into someone he no longer recognized. Greta feared that asking Klaus to abandon military service might destroy essential aspects of his identity that had attracted her from their first meeting. Yet as they talked through the night in their bombed building refuge, both came to understand that separation would definitely destroy what they had built together, while flight offered at least the possibility of preserving something worth the enormous risks involved. Their relationship had become too important to sacrifice for abstract concepts of duty to authorities who viewed their connection as evidence of disloyalty, rather than proof of humanity's capacity to transcend artificial divisions. Klaus made his decision with the quiet finality of someone who had weighed all alternatives and found only one acceptable choice. He would desert his unit on the night before their scheduled departure, using his knowledge of patrol schedules and security procedures to disappear into Vienna's civilian population. Greta would leave her position at the cathedral simultaneously, claiming family illness that required her immediate departure from the city. They would meet at coordinates provided by Greta's resistance contacts, beginning a journey toward uncertain safety in territory controlled by people whose motivations remained largely mysterious. The preparations required for their escape consumed their remaining time together with urgent intensity. Klaus needed to acquire civilian documentation that would allow him to travel without immediately attracting attention as a deserter. Greta had to memorize contact procedures for resistance networks, whose security protocols demanded perfect adherence to complex communication systems. Every detail of their plan required precision that left no margin for the kind of errors that would result in capture and execution. Klaus brought Greta items from his military gear that might prove useful during their flight. A compass that would help them navigate unfamiliar territory, emergency rations that could sustain them through periods when obtaining food became impossible, a knife designed for survival rather than combat. These practical gifts represented his commitment to their shared future, while acknowledging the harsh realities they would face as fugitives in a world that offered no sanctuary for people who had chosen love over loyalty to competing ideologies. Greta prepared for departure by selecting possessions that held enough personal meaning to preserve her sense of identity while remaining light enough for extended travel on foot. Sheet music that contained her favorite compositions, photographs of family members she might never see again, a small crucifix that had belonged to her grandmother. Each item represented connections to the person she used to be, anchors that might help her remember who she was when survival demanded constant adaptation to new circumstances. Their final night in the bombed building carried emotional weight that neither had anticipated during their earlier meetings. They were saying goodbye not just to a place, but to the people they had been before choosing each other over everything else they had valued. Klaus would never again be a German soldier following orders without question. Greta would never again be a choir singer whose greatest concerns involved musical interpretation rather than physical survival. But they were also celebrating the birth of something new between them, a partnership forged through shared risks that had revealed depths of commitment neither had known they possessed. Their love had evolved from romantic attraction into something more fundamental, a recognition that they had found in each other the most essential part of what made existence meaningful during humanity's darkest hour. Klaus told Greta about his vision of their life after escape, dreams that sustained him through the terror of what they were about to attempt. He imagined finding work as a farm laborer in some remote valley, where questions about past identities were discouraged by mutual understanding among people who had all fled from something. Greta would sing in village churches, where her voice could bring beauty to communities that had forgotten what joy sounded like after years of loss and fear. Greta shared her own hopes for their future together, possibilities that felt both impossibly distant and absolutely necessary for maintaining courage through whatever trials lay ahead. She dreamed of teaching music to children who had never known war, passing on traditions that connected them to centuries of human creativity that survived despite systematic efforts to destroy everything civilized and gentle. Klaus would learn to read musical notation properly, developing abilities that had been interrupted by military service but never completely abandoned. As dawn approached, bringing with it the beginning of the most dangerous day either had ever faced, Klaus and Greta held each other with desperate intensity in the ruins that had sheltered their final planning sessions. Outside their basement refuge, Vienna was beginning to stir with the sounds of a city under occupation, military vehicles moving through streets where civilians hurried to complete necessary errands before curfew restrictions took effect. But inside their sanctuary, time seemed suspended as they prepared to step across a threshold that would transform them from secret lovers into active rebels against every authority that governed their world. The choice they had made would either lead to freedom they could barely imagine or destruction that would end their story as completely as if they had never met in that candle-lit cathedral where everything began. Klaus extinguished their candle as the first pale light began filtering through cracks in the damaged building above them. In a few hours, they would begin the most dangerous journey of their lives, carrying nothing but their love for each other and faith that somewhere in the chaos of a world at war, two people who had chosen humanity over hatred might find the sanctuary they needed to build something beautiful from the ashes of everything they were leaving behind. The final preparations began with Klaus's careful observation of his unit's departure procedures, noting exactly when roll call would reveal his absence and trigger the manhunt that would follow. Military efficiency that had once protected him now became his greatest threat, systematic processes designed to account for every soldier's whereabouts at all times. He calculated that desertion discovered during morning formation would give them perhaps 6 hours before organized pursuit began in earnest. Greta spent her last day at the cathedral memorizing faces of fellow choir members she would never see again, listening to conversations about musical programs she would never help perform. The normal concerns of cathedral life felt surreal when weighed against the magnitude of what she would attempt that evening. She participated in rehearsals while mentally reviewing escape routes, sang familiar hymns while calculating timing that would determine whether she lived or died. The weight of their decision pressed down on both Klaus and Greta as the hours ticked toward their planned escape. Klaus had volunteered for final guard duty, positioning himself to observe the exact moment when his absence would create the smallest window of opportunity before discovery. Every routine interaction with fellow soldiers felt like performing in a play where he knew the ending, but couldn't reveal the plot to anyone else sharing the stage. Greta found herself studying the cathedral with new eyes during what she knew would be her final rehearsal. The soaring arches that had witnessed her transformation from frightened young woman to someone capable of extraordinary courage seemed to whisper farewell blessings as her voice carried through spaces that had sheltered their impossible love. She memorized the way afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, creating patterns that had become as familiar as breathing during months of secret planning. The resistance contact Greta had cultivated through careful cathedral conversations had provided instructions that chilled her blood while offering their only hope for survival. They would meet at a destroyed brewery on Vienna's outskirts, a location chosen for its multiple escape routes and minimal patrol activity. From there, guides would lead them through territory controlled by partisans who asked no questions about refugees fleeing German authority, but demanded absolute obedience to instructions that might mean the difference between freedom and mass graves. Klaus spent his final military hours reviewing maps that showed terrain features he might need to recognize during their flight. His training in land navigation, originally designed to help German forces maintain battlefield orientation, now became essential knowledge for evading the very armies he had served. The irony wasn't lost on him that skills developed to advance German military objectives would now be turned against everything his uniform represented. The physical preparations were matched by emotional ones that proved far more difficult to complete. Klaus wrote letters to his family that he could never send, attempting to explain decisions that would brand him a traitor in their eyes, while hoping they might someday understand that love had given him no alternative to desertion. The words felt inadequate for describing how meeting Greta had transformed his understanding of what made life worth preserving, when everything around them celebrated destruction. Greta composed her own impossible farewell to parents who would learn of her disappearance through official notifications that offered no explanation for why their daughter had abandoned everything they had sacrificed to provide. She tried to capture in writing how Klaus had shown her that choosing humanity over hatred was not weakness, but the strongest form of resistance imaginable against forces that sought to reduce people to nothing more than functions within larger machinery of control. Evening brought the final countdown toward decisions that would define everything about their remaining existence. Klaus performed his last patrol duties with mechanical precision, while his mind remained focused on timing calculations that allowed no margin for error. One moment of inattention, one unexpected change in routine, one fellow soldier's casual observation could unravel plans that represented their only hope for remaining together. Greta participated in evening prayers with fellow choir members who had no idea they were witnessing her final moments as part of their community. Her voice blended with others in familiar harmonies that had provided comfort through months of uncertainty, but now carried additional weight as she sang farewell to everything that had defined her identity before Klaus changed the trajectory of her entire life. The designated hour arrived with the inexorable precision of clockwork, designed to measure the most important moments of human existence. Klaus slipped away from his barracks during the brief interval between shift changes, when security protocols created temporary gaps in surveillance. His civilian clothes felt foreign against skin, accustomed to military wool, transforming him from soldier to refugee with clothing changes that represented far more than simple costume adjustment. Greta left the cathedral through service entrances she had memorized during weeks of careful observation, moving through Vienna's darkened streets with skills she had developed while navigating bombed buildings for secret meetings. Every shadow could conceal patrol units searching for curfew violators. Every sound might signal discovery by authorities who would show no mercy to civilians found violating movement restrictions after dark. The journey to their rendezvous point tested every lesson they had learned about survival in occupied territory. Klaus moved with military precision through routes he had mapped during legitimate patrol duties, using knowledge of German security procedures to avoid detection by the very forces he had once served. His training in tactical movement now served purposes that would have horrified the officers who had taught him to navigate hostile territory. Greta discovered reserves of courage she had never suspected during her transformation from protected choir singer to active fugitive. The skills required for reaching their meeting point safely were those of an experienced resistance operative, not someone whose greatest previous challenge had involved memorizing complex musical arrangements. Yet love had awakened capabilities that surprised her with their effectiveness under extreme pressure. The bombed brewery where they had arranged to meet stood like a monument to destruction's capacity for creating unexpected opportunities. Allied bombing runs that had targeted Vienna's industrial infrastructure had inadvertently created hiding places that served purposes no military planner had ever intended. Ruins that spoke of wars, destructive power now offered sanctuary to people seeking to preserve something beautiful that conflict had tried to eliminate. Klaus arrived first, his military training having provided advantages in navigation and timing that civilian experience could not match. The brewery's damaged structures offered excellent concealment while providing clear sight lines for observing approaching figures. He positioned himself where he could identify Greta's arrival, while remaining hidden from anyone else who might be moving through the area for less innocent purposes. Greta's approach through the brewery's ruins required careful navigation of debris that could betray her presence through careless footsteps on unstable surfaces. Her choir training had developed sensitivity to acoustics that now served survival purposes, helping her move through damaged buildings without creating sounds that might attract unwanted attention from patrol units conducting security sweeps of abandoned industrial areas. Their reunion in the destroyed brewery carried emotional intensity that neither had anticipated during their planning sessions. They had successfully completed the most dangerous phase of their escape, transforming themselves from secret lovers to active fugitives without detection by authorities who were already beginning systematic searches for Klaus's unexplained absence from military formations. But their relief was tempered by understanding that they had only begun a journey whose ultimate destination remained uncertain. The resistance contacts who would guide them to safety were strangers whose motivations and reliability could not be verified through normal means. They were placing their lives in hands of people who operated according to rules that prioritized operational security over individual welfare. Organizations that had learned to view personal relationships as potential vulnerabilities rather than sources of strength. The guides who emerged from the brewery's shadows were exactly what Klaus and Greta had expected from descriptions provided by their cathedral contact. Silent figures who communicated through gestures rather than words, people whose faces revealed nothing about their thoughts or feelings regarding the refugees they were helping to escape. These were individuals who had learned to suppress normal human responses in favor of calculated efficiency that maximized survival rates for everyone involved in resistance operations. Klaus found himself evaluated by eyes that missed nothing about his military bearing, posture that identified him as someone trained in combat techniques that could prove either valuable or dangerous, depending on his true loyalties. The resistance fighters were clearly assessing whether he represented genuine defection or elaborate deception, designed to infiltrate networks that had survived through extreme caution about trusting anyone whose background could not be completely verified. Greta sensed similar scrutiny from guides who understood that civilians fleeing German authority often carried information that could compromise resistance operations if they were captured and interrogated. Her association with cathedral activities made her potentially valuable as someone with knowledge of religious networks, but also dangerous if she had been turned into an unwitting intelligence source through conversations with authorities seeking information about underground activities. The departure from Vienna began with instructions delivered in whispers that emphasized absolute silence during movement through territory where discovery meant death for everyone involved. Klaus and Greta were given clothing that would help them blend with refugee populations moving through areas where German control was contested by advancing Allied forces. Their new identities came with backstories they needed to memorize perfectly, fictional histories that would provide cover if they were questioned by authorities during their journey toward uncertain freedom. Klaus found himself stripped of everything that had defined his identity for years, transformed from German soldier to displaced person, whose survival depended on convincing portrayal of someone fleeing the very forces he had once served. The psychological adjustment required for this transformation was more challenging than any physical hardship they would face during their escape, demanding that he reconstruct his sense of self around entirely different principles than those that had governed his military existence. Greta discovered that love had prepared her for sacrifices she could never have imagined making before meeting Klaus in that candle-lit cathedral. Abandoning her musical career and family connections felt like spiritual death, but she understood that preserving their relationship required leaving behind everything familiar in exchange for possibilities that could only be realized through complete commitment to their shared future. The guides led them through Vienna's outskirts along routes that avoided major transportation corridors, where German patrols maintained regular surveillance. Their movement followed patterns established through months of successful evacuations, paths that had been tested by other refugees, whose survival proved the effectiveness of procedures developed through careful study of German security weaknesses. As they left the city that had witnessed the birth of their impossible love, Klaus and Greta understood they were crossing more than geographical boundaries. They were entering territory where their relationship would face tests that went beyond external dangers to challenge the very foundations of what they had built together during those stolen moments in sacred and ruined spaces. Behind them, Vienna continued its existence under occupation, unaware that two people who had chosen humanity over hatred were beginning a journey that would determine whether love could survive the complete destruction of everything they had previously called home. The cathedral where their story began stood empty in the darkness, its silence holding memories of voices that had dared to find beauty in the midst of humanity's darkest hour. The path ahead stretched through forests that had become graveyards for empires, where the skeletal remains of abandoned military equipment rusted beneath snow-laden branches that whispered secrets about the futility of conquest. Klaus recognized terrain features from maps he had studied during his military service, but seeing them now as a fugitive rather than a conqueror transformed familiar landscapes into alien territory, where every landmark carried different meanings than those he had learned to associate with tactical advantage. Their guides moved with the fluid efficiency of people who had perfected the art of becoming invisible, leading Klaus and Greta through routes that followed deer paths and abandoned logging roads rather than the major thoroughfares where German forces maintained checkpoints designed to intercept exactly the kind of movement they were attempting. The resistance fighters communicated through hand signals that Klaus found himself learning with surprising speed, his military training providing unexpected advantages in understanding tactical communication systems. Greta struggled with physical demands that her life as a choir singer had never required her to develop. Hours of walking through difficult terrain left her muscles aching in ways that reminded her constantly of how completely she had abandoned everything familiar about her existence. Yet she found herself adapting to hardships that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier, discovering reserves of endurance that love had awakened alongside the courage that had enabled her to choose flight over safety. The first night of their journey brought them to a farmhouse that existed in the contested zone between German-controlled territory and areas where partisan activity made occupation increasingly difficult to maintain. The building showed evidence of recent fighting, bullet holes in wooden walls and windows, boarded with planks that spoke of people learning to survive in landscapes where violence had become as routine as weather patterns. Klaus found himself studying the tactical situation with instincts that remained sharp despite his rejection of military service. The farmhouse had been chosen for defensive advantages that would allow rapid evacuation, if resistance activities attracted unwanted attention from German forces conducting anti-partisan operations. Every aspect of their temporary shelter reflected lessons learned through conflicts that had claimed the lives of people who made strategic mistakes in environments where error meant death. Greta discovered that their hosts were a family whose own survival depended on assistance they provided to refugees fleeing various forms of persecution. The elderly couple who opened their home to strangers asked no questions about backgrounds or destinations, understanding that knowledge could become dangerous if authorities decided to investigate their activities. Their willingness to risk everything for people they had never met before demonstrated forms of courage that Greta was learning to recognize as more common than she had previously imagined. The conversations that developed during their brief stay revealed networks of mutual assistance that had emerged spontaneously throughout occupied Europe, communities of people who had decided that preserving human dignity was worth whatever personal costs such choices might entail. Klaus listened to stories about German deserters who had been helped to safety, discovering that his decision to abandon military service was part of a larger pattern of individual resistance to ideologies that demanded the destruction of personal conscience. Greta learned about musicians and artists who had disappeared from official cultural life, rather than participate in programs designed to serve propaganda purposes. People who had chosen obscurity over collaboration with authorities that sought to transform creative expression into instruments of political control. Her own flight from cathedral duties placed her within traditions of artistic resistance that stretched back through centuries of people who had refused to let their talents be corrupted by forces that valued utility over beauty. The farm family's teenage son had been conscripted into German service months earlier, but had deserted during his first engagement with partisan forces rather than fire upon people defending their own communities. His parents spoke of their pride in his moral courage, while acknowledging the constant fear they lived with regarding his safety as a fugitive, whose capture would result in execution, as an example to other potential deserters. Klaus found himself engaged in conversations with the young deserter that revealed perspectives he had never encountered during his military service. The boy described witnessing atrocities that had convinced him that wearing a German uniform made him complicit in activities that violated everything his family had taught him about basic human decency. His decision to abandon military service had been motivated by recognition that some orders could not be followed by people who intended to remain human. The parallels between their stories created bonds that transcended the artificial divisions that military organization had tried to impose between different units and ranks. Klaus realized that his love for Greta had awakened moral sensibilities that had always existed within him, but had been suppressed by training designed to transform individual conscience into unquestioning obedience to authority figures whose commands might contradict fundamental principles of human dignity. Greta spent hours talking with the farmer's wife about the practical challenges of maintaining family relationships when political circumstances made normal social connections dangerous or impossible. The woman described years of carefully managed communication with relatives who had made different choices about collaboration with German authority, relationships that required constant navigation between genuine affection and prudent suspicion about whose loyalty could be trusted completely. These conversations illuminated the complexity of survival in circumstances where every relationship carried potential for both salvation and betrayal, where people learned to compartmentalize their emotional lives in ways that protected essential connections, while acknowledging that complete trust had become a luxury that few could afford. Greta began understanding that her relationship with Klaus existed within larger patterns of human connection that had adapted to extraordinary pressures without losing their essential capacity for providing meaning and support. The second day of travel brought weather that transformed their journey from difficult to genuinely life-threatening. Snow began falling with intensity that reduced visibility to mere yards, while creating conditions that made every step treacherous on terrain that offered no shelter from wind, that cut through their inadequate clothing like blades, designed specifically for inflicting suffering on people foolish enough to travel during winter storms. Klaus found himself drawing upon survival training that had been designed for military operations in harsh environments, but applying those skills to protecting Greta rather than maintaining combat effectiveness. His knowledge of how to recognize and prevent hypothermia became essential for keeping her alive as temperatures dropped to levels that could kill within hours if proper precautions were not maintained consistently. Greta discovered that extremes of physical discomfort could actually intensify emotional connections rather than weakening them, as if shared suffering stripped away everything superficial and left only what truly mattered between people who had chosen to face hardship together. The misery of trudging through snow that reached their knees while wind howled around them with almost personal malevolence somehow deepened her appreciation for Klaus's presence beside her. Their guides demonstrated expertise in cold weather survival that reflected years of moving people through territory, where nature collaborated with human enemies to create obstacles that tested every aspect of physical and psychological endurance. The resistance fighters knew locations of shelters that had been prepared specifically for emergency situations, caves and abandoned structures that could provide protection from weather that would otherwise make travel impossible. The shelter they reached after hours of struggle through the storm was a hunting cabin that had been modified by previous refugees into something approaching habitability during extreme weather. The structure contained supplies left by people who understood that survival often depended on cooperation between strangers who might never meet, but shared common needs for basic necessities that meant the difference between life and death. Klaus and Greta found themselves sharing space with other refugees, whose stories revealed the vast scope of displacement that war had created throughout occupied Europe. A Jewish family fleeing deportation orders that would separate parents from children permanently. Polish intellectuals whose education made them targets for elimination policies designed to destroy potential leadership within occupied populations. French resistance fighters whose cover had been compromised by betrayal from sources they had trusted completely. Each story illuminated different aspects of the systematic destruction that German occupation had brought to communities throughout Europe, but also revealed forms of resistance and mutual assistance that had emerged in response to policies designed to eliminate human solidarity. Greta listened to accounts of people who had risked everything to help strangers, discovering that her own choice to abandon security for love was part of much larger patterns of moral courage that were defining how individuals responded to institutional evil. Klaus engaged in conversations with other deserters who had abandoned military service rather than participate in activities that violated their personal understanding of acceptable behavior during wartime. These discussions revealed that his decision to choose love over military duty was not unique, but part of widespread recognition among ordinary soldiers that following orders had moral limits that could not be crossed without destroying essential aspects of human identity. The diversity of refugees seeking shelter in the cabin demonstrated that resistance to German occupation took many forms beyond organized military opposition. Teachers who refused to implement educational curricula designed to indoctrinate children with racial hatred. Doctors who treated patients regardless of their ethnic background. Farmers who shared food with people fleeing persecution, despite regulations that made such assistance punishable by death. Greta began understanding that her relationship with Klaus represented one example of countless individual choices that collectively constituted a form of resistance more powerful than any organized military campaign. every act of human connection that transcended artificial boundaries imposed by occupying authorities, challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which control systems depended for their effectiveness. The storm that had driven them to shelter continued for 3 days, creating enforced intimacy among refugees who might otherwise have remained strangers, protecting their secrets through careful distance from people whose backgrounds could not be verified completely. The prolonged confinement broke down normal barriers between individuals, who discovered that shared vulnerability created bonds that transcended differences in education, nationality, or previous social status. Klaus found himself helping to care for children whose parents had been separated from them during chaotic evacuations, applying patience and gentleness that he had never known he possessed during his military service. His interactions with these displaced young people revealed aspects of his character that Greta had only glimpsed during their private conversations, depths of compassion that made her love for him feel even more justified despite the enormous costs their relationship was demanding. Greta discovered that her musical training provided unexpected value in maintaining morale among people whose psychological state was as fragile as their physical condition. Her voice, lifted in songs that reminded everyone of beauty that survived despite systematic efforts to destroy it, created moments of transcendence that helped sustain hope during circumstances that might otherwise have led to complete despair. The cabin became a temporary community where people learned to support each other through shared recognition that survival depended on maintaining human connections that authorities sought to sever through policies designed to isolate individuals within structures that discouraged mutual assistance. Klaus and Greta observed how quickly strangers could become family when external pressures created circumstances that demanded cooperation for basic survival. When the storm finally passed, leaving behind landscape transformed into pristine beauty that seemed to mock the human suffering it had created, their guides announced that the next phase of their journey would take them into territory where German control was becoming increasingly theoretical, as advancing Allied forces made occupation impossible to maintain through normal military procedures. Klaus and Greta's story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hour, love found a way to triumph over the machinery of hatred. Their choice to see each other's humanity, rather than uniforms and labels, changed everything. They proved that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance isn't taking up arms, but simply refusing to let the world turn your heart to stone. Their love became a beacon of hope that still shines across the decades, showing us that compassion will always be stronger than the forces that try to divide us.